The hotline linking North and South Korea is in news again. Pyongyang wants to talk about next month's Winter Olympics, but Seoul also wants to discuss its nuclear program. Will next week's meeting ease tensions or make things worse? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hashim Ahalbara. North Korea's leader Kim Jong Un started off 2018 by extending an olive branch to the country's southern neighbour. And now Kim's New Year's Day address has led to planned talks between the long-time rivals. Delegations from the two nations will meet on Tuesday for the first face-to-face talks in 2 years. During that time, North Korea has conducted 3 nuclear tests and fired more than 40 missiles, including its most advanced yet. But even as it calls for reduced tensions, Pyongyang insists it won't get rid of its nuclear program. So how much can Tuesday's talks really achieve? We'll get to our guests in just a moment. But first, Florence Louis has this report from Seoul.
In a few days, the truce village of Panmunjom on the Demilitarized Zone that separates North and South Korea will be a hive of activity. Representatives from the two countries will hold high-level talks here for the first time in more than 2 years. Earlier this week, North Korean leader Kim Jong Un initiated dialogue in his New Year's Day address. 4 days later, his government agreed to hold talks. The announcement came just hours after the US and South Korea agreed to postpone annual military drills scheduled for the end of February. These have long been regarded as provocative by Pyongyang.
The two leaders agreed not to conduct South Korea-US joint military drills during the Pyeongchang Olympics and to do their best to ensure the security of the Olympics.
Next week's discussions will center on North Korea's participation in the upcoming Winter Olympics, as well as generally improving inter-Korea relations. But officials here in South Korea are also hoping the negotiations will eventually lead to North Korea returning to international talks on its nuclear program. Even so, President Moon Jae-In is cautiously optimistic, saying we should refrain from making premature judgment or expectation. The Japanese defense minister also sounded a note of caution.
North Korea goes through phases of apparent dialogue and provocation, but either way, North Korea is continuing its nuclear and missile development. We have no intention of weakening our warning and surveillance.
Kim, in his New Year's Day speech, said North Korea would maintain its nuclear weapons program and even called for the mass production and deployment of nuclear warheads and missiles.
From the conservative perspective, North Korea is trying to buy time. The majority seems to believe that North Korea is trying to finalize its technical development to achieve operational ICBM. So, as US CIA has announced before, they are talking about 2-3 month time in terms of finalizing the ICBM system. And it looks like this is a perfect action on their side, to buy time.
Last year, North Korea test-fired 3 intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, including one that it says is capable of reaching the US mainland. Many hope the upcoming talks remain the best option for now of de-escalating the crisis on the Korean peninsula. Florence Louis, Al Jazeera, Seoul.
There have been some diplomatic breakthroughs on the Korean peninsula in the past with varying results. The first inter-Korean summit was held in 2000. The two sides signed a declaration allowing separated families to have reunion meetings. 7 years later, there were renewed calls for international mediation. The second summit ended with a declaration to continue working towards a permanent peace treaty. But diplomacy has fizzled since then. The last round of talks happened in December 2015 and ended in failure. North Korea stopped answering communication lines inside the Demilitarized Zone in February 2016. Let's bring in our guests. In Seoul, In Pyeongchang, a retired lieutenant general with the South Korean Army. And joining us on Skype from Tokyo, Michael Pan, president of the Chengstu News Agency. Thank you for joining us. Let me start by asking Mr. Trump this. Is the meeting purely about Winter Olympics or there's more to the story?
We're hoping that this will lead to further negotiations and talks that will set a stage or a foundation for a easement of tensions on the Korean Peninsula and hopefully a resolution to the nuclear issue that has been arising in this region, which is affecting the world.
Mr. Pan, is this purely an attempt by the North Koreans to test waters, or do you think that this could be a genuine attempt to move forward and solve the long disputes between all the parties?
Well, I think that it is genuine, is my sense, but of course it really depends on what your expectations are. If your expectation is that this is going to lead to denuclearization of North Korea's policy, well, that's not going to happen. But it is a genuine attempt, I think, to reduce war tensions and to try to bring some degree of normalcy back to the situation.
Mr. Chum, the reason why I was asking you the question about the real reasons behind the overture is because it brings back memories from 1988 during the Winter Olympics in Seoul. North Koreans stepped in and they said they would like to join a unified team. Then they said they wanted to co-host the games with the South Koreans. Then they pulled out and created an international crisis back then. Is there any political agenda here?
I think it's hard to say right now, but I think it's safe to assume that there is a political agenda. We won't know until we actually come to a meeting table with the North Koreans, which will happen in a couple of days. So I think it would be prudent to see and wait to see what happens during those meetings and those initial talks.
Let's move a little bit beyond the Korean Peninsula, Mr. Pan. What is the general sentiment among the Japanese about what is happening now?
Well, I think the general sentiment, if you talk about Japanese public as a whole, is there's a general welcoming of the fact that the tensions have been reduced somewhat, although I do think that there's also a lot of caution. The Japanese public probably isn't deeply aware of what's going on quite yet. This is quite new information, and many of them have just been on vacation. As from the Japanese government's perspective, the Abe government's perspective, it's a very different outlook. The Abe government, I think you can fairly say, does not welcome the peace talks at this time. This is exactly what they didn't want in terms of their own domestic political agenda, which right now is moving forward towards possibly revising the Japanese constitution. From Abe's perspective, actually tensions would be more appropriate than reduced tensions.
Mr. Chum, I mean, you served in the military in South Korea. I mean, initiating contact in the demilitarized zone between the two countries, what does it mean from a military perspective, from a logistics perspective, and is it going to be conducive to broader talks about a permanent settlement of the crisis in the peninsula?
Well, first off, along the border, as far as I know, there has not been any kind of buildup of forces. So I don't think that there will be any immediate talks about reduction because there has not been any kind of buildup along the demilitarized zone itself. Now, in the future, of course, this is a critical item that needs to be talked, but this is in the far away future. Right now, our focus is somehow denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula, and before that, how we will be able to ease tensions in this area to reach that goal.
But do you think that the first meeting is just going to be confidence-building measure, or they would move forward and start tackling the nuclear issue, knowing that the North Koreans made it quite clear that this is a red line?
Yes, so you brought up a very important point there, confidence-building measures. We haven't had many of those in recent years. So one of the first challenges that we face is how are we going to build some trust? And maybe this is an area where the South Korean government can broker some sort of role between the North Koreans and the United States and other neighbors within the region.
Mr. Pan, Shinzo Abe described the mounting tension as the most severe situation his country faces since a Second World War. I mean, is this meeting, is it likely to further stoke tension, or is it good news from a government perspective in Japan?
Right. Well, I mean, to be honest, I think Shinzo Abe was going to give that same exact speech, even if nothing happened during the holiday break. That was planned from well ahead of time. You know, Shinzo Abe right now is just about to embark this year on an effort to try to revise the Japanese constitution. And part of his argument why this needs to be done is because Japan is under an imminent military threat, most clearly from North Korea. And so a reduction of tensions, peace talks, this is not what he wanted at this time. This is exactly, so far the Japanese government hasn't even reacted. They haven't said, we welcome the talks, we welcome a reduction of tensions. Nothing of that sort has been said by the Japanese government at all yet, because in fact they don't want it to happen.
Let's further explore what's on the table here and what's the options for all the parties. Mr. Chum, President Moon Jae-In is a big fan of the Sunshine Policy. He would like to pursue the same agenda, try to shower the Northern Koreans with more incentives to convince them to set aside their nuclear and weapons ambitions. Are we likely to see him pursue the same policy?
I think we're stretching a little bit by saying that the Moon administration is a big fan of the Sunshine Policy. I think the administration fully understands the restrictions and the difference between the initial Sunshine Policy period and what it is today, mainly that the North Koreans have nuclear weapons. So if we want to ease tensions on the Korean Peninsula, I think we will be doing this in coordination with not only the United States, our closest ally, but our neighbors around us, so that we can ensure that the goal is very clear. It's the denuclearization of North Korea, and to ensure that proliferation of these very dangerous weapons do not occur. So although the Sunshine Policy is a means to open and have a more free North Korea, I don't think that this administration is under the misconception that it's going to be the same as 20 years before.
Genuine, not a genuine overture, Mr. Pan. I mean, the Japanese would like to see an aggressive approach. Mr. Chum is saying that the Sunshine Policy hasn't brought about any significant change in the past. But then the question is, what's the option if you cannot move forward with political talks? The North Koreans made it clear, no concessions whatsoever on their program. Take it or leave it.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, I would say it really depends on your expectations. I think that any effort to convince the North Korean regime to give up its nuclear weapons, whether that effort be through sanctions or through talks, is going to be a failure. And the reason is quite simple. I think that the Kim regime sees these weapons as absolutely necessary to its own continued survival. So can you really expect them to give up something which they see as their lifeline? I don't think you can. But what I do think we can do, and I think that should be the goal of the policy, is to try to at least avoid a catastrophic war that could kill many, many people. And so I think that that should be what our focus should be on, is to avoid the worst case scenarios and to try to bring things down to sort of a sane, reasonable level where at least we're talking, and at least the the fear of an immediate war is off the table.
Mr. Chum, you've been mentioning the idea of broadening the sphere of the partners to come together and negotiate a permanent solution to the crisis. Do you believe that bringing the Japanese, the Chinese, the Russians, the Americans to come together, South Koreans, North Koreans, could be the best option to try to initiate an ambitious program that could end the crisis?
Before I answer that question, I just want to remind everyone that the Moon administration so far has been very firm in its responses towards the provocations that the North Koreans have been activating recently. If you look at the responses, immediate show of force, demonstrations, combined operations, all of these have shown the North Koreans that they're dealing with not only a liberal and progressive government in South Korea, but a firm South Korean government and a strong U.S.-Korean alliance here.
But that's not, by the way,
I also believe that
I can see what you're hinting at, Mr. Chum, but at the same time, that does not seem to be the case. We've seen Moon Jae-In distancing himself from the rhetoric of President Trump and saying, basically, I would like to give diplomacy a chance. This is exactly why he stepped in and he said, give the go-ahead to the bilateral talks, so the two delegations to meet as soon as possible and move forward, which was not absolutely in any way the case for the Americans.
It's too early to tell what the full intentions of the North Koreans are, but I think the South Koreans and the United States are willing to give them the benefit of the doubt for the moment and see where all of this leads to. But with the foundations of making sure that we are in a firm position and not of weakness.
Okay, Mr. Pan, I mean, what do you think the U.S. will stand in this particular idea of resuming to talks? We've seen the tweets by President Trump, the statements made by Nikki Haley, and they were very critical of the North Korean government. Do you think that this time they will try to pull out to give diplomacy better chances?
I think that we should be very wary about what U.S. policy is going to be during this period. I mean, frankly, you know, if you're going to seriously analyze what is the Trump foreign policy, it's many things all at the same time. The Tillerson policy, the Haley policy, the Donald Trump policy, they're all on different tracks, basically. And so I think that, you know, probably the greatest source of instability and unpredictability is where the U.S. government's going to come down in all of this. But certainly, if you take the point of view of the establishment, it's going to be basically very skeptical of any moves made by North Korea and will not look too warmly at these talks between the two parties.
Mr. Chum, you have the South Koreans who say that they would like to give a chance to those talks. At the same time, you have your biggest ally, the United States of America. Its president has been using terms like fire and fury, and that he will totally destroy North Korea. This rhetoric, do you believe that it is going to lead the area anywhere towards a peaceful settlement, or just stoke fire and conflict?
Yeah, I think a couple of hours ago, President Trump took credit upon himself, saying that because he did make those statements, that it made the North Koreans aware of the firm resolve of not only the United States, but the
Do you believe that
alliance,
tweet? Do you believe what he said?
Yes, I think that it was the firm stance of the U.S. president did form the circumstances for where we are today, and hopefully this will lead to a better solution than war.
Mr. Pan, Japan is closely monitoring the situation. There are two options here. A breakthrough that would lead to a genuine dialogue. Many people are skeptical about it, or more tension. Shinzo Abe said that he's going to give the deadline for 2020. If nothing happens, he will revise the constitution. and then to pave the way for Japan to have its own armed forces. Is this a likely scenario?
Well, I think that one of the most predictable players in all of this is definitely Shinzo Abe, and that's that he's going to keep being an advocate of pressure, sanctions, doing everything in terms of putting more and more pressure on North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons, which is going to go nowhere. And so what you can expect is a consistent hard line coming from Tokyo, which produces no results.
Mr. Chum, I would like to ask you this. This is a nation, I mean, both countries have been together for more than 1,000 years, separated for almost 70 years. Are there any chances that they can come together one day, set aside their differences and negotiate a permanent solution where we might ultimately see one nation? Or do you think this is wishful thinking for the time being?
Yes, as a Korean, I have this enduring hope that once again we will be unified. And it's not just a hope, it's an eventuality. The only question is how it will look. So I have a firm belief that we will one day be unified, and that a unified Korea will contribute not only to this region but to world peace.
Is there any concern among the Koreans right now that if the talks fail, that could have some impact on the Winter Games?
For now, I think a lot of Koreans are relieved that the North Koreans, especially their leader, Kim Jong Un himself, has announced that he's willing to use dialogue and negotiations. Where this will lead, to be honest with you, I think we just have to do our best and see where it will lead. But I'm hoping for the best. I hope that after the Winter Olympics, we will use that opportunity for a resolution where both sides will be able to negotiate and work for peace.
Okay. Mr. Pan, I mean, we've been trying to touch upon some different aspects of the story, particularly the possibility for a breakthrough that could be conducive to political talks, and that could also help the whole region. I would like to go back to the same question as asked initially. I mean, from a Japanese perspective, is this something that can solely be negotiated between North-South, or they believe that key players, countries with huge leverage, China, Russia, Japan, the United States of America, are the sole guarantors of a permanent solution to the crisis in the Korean Peninsula?
Frankly, I don't really see that there is a strategic goal really at play that's visible if you're talking about Japanese government policy. What's the end game? What is it that they would like to see at the end of the process? And so far, there hasn't really been any vision that's been put out there by the Japanese government. And the idea basically that through pressure, they're going to get everything they want doesn't seem to be realistic, and nobody really expects that to happen. So it's not clear that there is really a strategy, per se, going on among the Japanese government. But more broadly, among the Japanese public, there's always a strong desire for peace. It's a country that has a strong pacifist sentiment since World War II, and they would like to have positive and friendly relations with all of their neighbors.
It would be interesting to see how things move forward in the coming days and weeks. Mr. Chum, Mr. Pan, thank you very much indeed for your contribution to the program. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashim Ahlbal, and the whole team here. Bye for now.